Welcome to What Is It About the Weather, the weekly podcast where we explore the many ways that weather is woven into our everyday lives and the fascinating and intriguing and exciting things it can lead to. I'm your host, Mark Jelinek, and this week we're going to be talking about bugs. That's right, we're going to dig into the weather-bug connection. But before I do that, let me just say I hope your intertwined weather world has been enjoyable since we last talked. I know that mine has had a few interesting points. I know we don't really spend a lot of time on weather itself here, and whether it rained or didn't, or snowed or didn't, or was just bright and sunny. But there's certain times of year that are kind of like launching points for seasons. And I don't mean the normal winter, spring, summer, fall stuff, but tropical cyclone season. And there are different basins around the globe, and each get a little more coverage than others, but probably the one that gets the most is the North Atlantic Basin, of which I border up against. And I think a lot has to do with, certainly just the amount of population that's at risk. That's not to say there aren't other areas. There's been, some interesting and even severe, very severe storms in the southern hemisphere this year, which we don't always see. That season's not always, or traditionally isn't as active with as many storms as we're used to hearing about in the northern hemisphere. But Usually my season here in the Atlantic, official kickoff is June, but every so often we get some of those early season storms. And this year we had one a few weeks back, and I don't remember if I would mention it or not, that didn't turn into anything. There was all this talk about the subtropical storm, and I don't know, it was kind of a slow news period weather-wise, and so there was a lot of focus on it. But this one didn't seem to catch as much. And I think part of that is people get burned. They cover that first one. It looks like it might do something interesting, and people are all talking about it. And nothing happens. And again, we're so early in the season, we tend, not to get storms this early. And so there was this second thing that, was kind of interesting looking, might turn into something. And ultimately it did. And first it was a subtropical depression. I'm not going to get into the nuances of the differences between the two. Don't get hung up on it. But then it turned into what was called a true tropical depression, and then got named. So Tropical Storm Arlene. And April is really kind of an odd time. We've had, I can even remember, I don't remember if it was last year or the year before, where we had some sort of storm going on in January. Sometimes you get these lingering storms that almost carry on from the previous year, but usually this kind of core winter into early spring time frame, we don't see them much in this basin. Now you may get some early ones in May before the official season starts, and then we actually tend to hit another lull. The cause of some of these early storms tends to be a little different than the traditional core season, which doesn't happen really until summer starting to wind down here in the northern hemisphere. So the peak in the season is September, so it is unusual to have it this time of year. Any case, Arlene was all of a sudden making all the rounds on Twitter, and just a reminder that it's time to start thinking about tropical storm. Now the good news is I saw some people, in this day and age, it's a little easier to do quick stats than it used to be and share those quick stats on Twitter. And that was the case. So, what does an April tropical storm mean to, the rest of the season? And the short answer is nothing. Again, part of it is likely due to the formation mechanisms are typically different in these early season storms than the traditional tropical storm. So fret not one way or the other, whether you want, you want to see a lot of tropical storms this year, or whether you're really hoping it'll be quiet. This probably had nothing to do with what you can expect. Although, if you investigate it, maybe you find it would. The other thing this week was I gave my last lecture in the class I've been teaching, and that's just sort of strange. This whole experiment of teaching a class at a college slash university, I guess I should say that. It's been an interesting experiment for me. I learned a lot. Learned how I would teach the class differently next time around. But it's been a lot of fun. That's for sure. Hopefully my students feel that way. Hopefully they got something out of it. I know I'm not the prototypical normal professor type, but having worked in this field and seen how people use the forecast that we generate, and different ways I've been involved in the weather enterprise, it was nice to be able to take some of that and translate it into the topic, such that it wasn't just about the science, but how the science would be applied should they decide to enter the workforce in the weather enterprise. All right, enough about the non-topic topic. Let's get into bugs. Let's get into these insect things. And I don't know if you ever, I hear it, I've heard it multiple times, I guess. I'm guessing that other people have too. That there's people talk and they say, well, if we don't get a strong enough winter, there'll be more insects next year. Or, different ways of saying the same thing. It's a good harsh winter will limit the bug population for the next year. And I, thought, hey, it's worth investigating. Is this really true? Right? How much of a role does the type of winter we have really have on bugs? Is this something even? Is it as we said in past episodes, a folklore sort of thing, a wives' tale sort of thing, or is there real truth to it? So, set off doing some investigation to try to understand, is it true? Is it true that, a good cold winter will limit those bugs? And the short answer is probably not much. I know you all are stunned, shocked, mortified, terrified of this grand news element. But there were some interesting things I found in that. Now, everything with so much with weather, right? It's about abnormal behavior. It's about how extreme the weather is. And that holds true in this case as well. So there's certainly the argument that an abnormally cold winter, or particularly if you had not just cold, but cold for an extraordinarily long time. But what's key to keep in mind is that's got to be abnormal. It's not just about cold. It's got to be more so than normal. Take, for example, there's areas of the United States or Europe or Asia, or, this can hold true in the southern hemisphere as well. Even in the Arctic areas, okay, whether it's North Pole area or Antarctica, there's insects that exist in these places. And given how cold those areas are most of the time, you'd say to yourself, well, they survive. And that tends to be the case. So if you had much colder than normal, and that lasted a much longer time than normal, like even more so than a normal cold spell, right, or an abnormally cold spell, it would really need to go on a long time, because the likely scenario is those insects that thrive in wherever you are adapt to dealing with what is the weather in that area. Now, again, doesn't mean that can't have any impact. It's particularly important for maybe species that have moved into the region that weren't always in the region. So what we would call invading species. So let's say an insect. I was reading about stink bugs. And there's a certain type of, there's all sorts of stink bugs. And if you don't know about stink bugs, Google it. These insects, all sorts of varieties and everything. There's one that's been entered into the U.S. from an Asian origin. And I don't know exactly the details, but it came in the late 90s. And I guess, again, it's an invading species, so that species may not be used to the type of winter in certain parts of the U.S., and that could limit it. Or anything, again, one that it's expanded its range because maybe over time it's gotten a little warmer or a little colder in an area, and it's pushed these migration patterns, these long-term habits of these insects to move into different areas that traditionally they weren't in. And that this can be true of many species, right? I mean, I think about, I grew up here in the South, and I don't remember there being so many Canadian geese year-round. You know, they'd fly through and then they'd fly back over, but we didn't see many of them, and now they just seem to be everywhere, right? It's a similar type of thing. And you can see this kind of impact with insects. Not surprising. You'd expect that to be the case. So these invading species, as we're calling them, but really kind of non-traditional species for the area, can be impacted more so and are likely to be more sensitive because traditionally they're used to a certain type of winter, right? And there's always certain species that are going to be more sensitive than others. And actually, I mean, there are some species of insects that winter kills them off. But they thought about that in advance, and it's just part of their life cycle. So it's not really a surprising thing. So the short answer is, maybe not so much. But let's talk a little bit about how they do deal with winter, because I mean, that to me is kind of the interesting part. So as I just mentioned, there are a few ways that they deal with it. And one of them is to just accept the fact that winter's going to kill them. And, you know, as an example, there's certain types of crickets that go into the process of laying their eggs before winter sets in. And the adults, when it gets cold, just die off. And then when spring comes around, the new ones hatch. It's just part of the cycle, right? Now, you could argue that an unusually early cold spell might catch them unawares, and that's always possible. And those things can have impacts. But generally speaking, you know, they've worked it in. They know when it's getting cold, just like plants do. And again, that's, you know, plants can be thrown off a little bit by earlier unusual changes in the season, and that can be coming out of spring as well. So some ways to deal with it, like the cricket, is just to work it into the life cycle, right? Another is they can take a trip, migrate, just like other creatures. And a classic example of this is the monarch butterfly. And for those that follow the monarch, they know that, you know, this is a big traveling butterfly that, you know, moves north to south. And whether it's specifically due to the weather, I don't know. And I read mixed stories on that, or it's not well documented. But we do know they migrate. The question is, do they migrate specifically because of the weather? Based on the patterns and when they do it, you would think so. But there might be more to it than that. But, you know, the monarch butterfly, classic example of migrating, just like many bird species, like those Canadian geese that no longer migrate. They sit around here. Another way, you know, we hear about it with mammals of certain types. You know, bears hibernate, chipmunks hibernate, a lot of creatures hibernate. Well, so do insects. Now, their goal is finding the right place to hibernate. And again, stupid hibernation could lead to death of certain ones. But overall, that's just part of what they do. And the interesting thing is the way we live has impacted insects. I don't know any of you have ever seen like a ladybug hatching, or what it seems like all of a sudden, you know, they seem to be coming out of the air vent. Well, ladybugs, as an example, use our homes as a place to hibernate for the winter. It's kind of perfect. Yeah, they might get a little warm, a little cold, but it's certainly going to be warmer than just being outside. So they find a nice spot, get in there, hang out, do their hibernation, come out in the spring, and all of a sudden you see this, what, like I said, seems like a ladybug hatching. And the reality is it's just time for them to get on and come out of hibernation. You also see some different behaviors with colonies, and whether that can be something like ants, which would tend to maybe just dig down a little further, a little further below a freeze line, traditional thing. And again, really harsh winter can drop that freeze line further into the soil, but it's not going to be instantaneous. And if they had to, they could probably burrow a little further. Although in Georgia red clay like here, they might have a harder time doing it. Although I don't know. I've seen ants kind of make Georgia red clay even look easy. So, or bees, as an example. So bees, you got these hive things. And an interesting thing they'll do is all the activity of their body does create some warmth. I mean, you've heard this before, huddle together to stay warm, this kind of collective body unit thing. But one of the things you got to keep in mind, and I think the bees have kind of figured this out, is they rotate. So you move to the center, get warmed up, and then you move to the outside. Of course, the queen doesn't go anywhere, but you create this situation where the warmth stays kind of in this core, and then you go to the outside, almost cooling off like, how you would a radiator. And then once you're almost too cold, you get to move back in and get warmed up again. So all sorts of techniques. And as with so many creatures, it's for the ones that go into a hibernation or that lay their larvae or their eggs and then die off, the key for them will be picking the right place. If they pick something that's too exposed, well, that group of them might die off. But generally speaking, they kind of have this process worked out. But every so often they may pick a place and it gets disturbed or something during the wintertime. Well, of course, that's going to kill them off. But what was interesting, so there's, again, a little more length into the short answer, which is, it can impact some, but not as much as you might think. Not as much as maybe is stated when you hear that phrase. It's probably a lot less impactful than you would imagine. But on the flip side of that, warmer winters may have an interesting flip side effect. So I was watching bugs, insects, whatever you want to call them. Let's call them insects. Hatching, what seemed like very early this year. I was walking across campus one day going to lunch. I was coming out, and it was certainly a hatching for a specific species. And you've probably been around when that happens. It's like all of a sudden you're overwhelmed with this one type of bug. And I had another one around. I don't remember where I was. This probably past a week or two ago, and parked my car and was trying to get something out of the car, and all of a sudden all these insects were seemingly coming out of nowhere and getting in my car, and that was the last thing I wanted. So, we've all experienced this sort of thing. But with that early hatching, when I was walking across campus, it made me think, well, what if it's too warm? Well, that can actually be detrimental just as much as a really, really prolonged and unusual cold could be. In that if they hatch too soon, and let's say by chance, and this isn't completely uncommon, that whatever they feed off of doesn't activate at the same time. Or let's say it gets warm enough for they hatch, but then it cools off again, and it kind of slows down the process. And this can be particularly true of things that go after certain crops or certain fruits and vegetables. Now, the ones that occur naturally, they're probably pretty good in sync with. But ones that are planted by people, if you have a mild winter, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go plant your crop really early, because you're kind of used to a routine, and as long as the normal growing cycle is still going to be there, there's no reason to get a month head start necessarily. So the insects may come out. They may be used to certain people planting within a certain period of time. When you think about how much vegetation we plant each year with food, and might die off because that's not available soon enough. And the other thing in all this, we keep talking about temperature, but probably a bigger thing is the moisture. I mean, mosquitoes are the classic example, and that's where I'd always heard it. Good winter will kill off the mosquito population, and again, that's just been proven, or the research that I looked into says it's just really not true. Probably the more important thing is moisture, because for mosquitoes to do their thing, they got to go and hatch and lay their eggs in water, standing water. And so if you have a dry spring, there's nowhere for them to put their eggs. Likely to have a bigger influence. It was also interesting, I was mentioning these Antarctic sort of bugs. There are bugs that actually fill their body with more sugars, or essentially alcohols of a certain type, that work like antifreeze in the car. So they turn their body into a big, again, radiator to keep it from freezing. I don't know, interesting techniques that these bugs have for surviving. But the short answer is, not so much. Might impact a little bit with really unusual circumstances. Might lead to timing differences is probably what you're more likely to see. But in terms of the core bug season, yeah, it may make it longer. So if the bugs come out earlier, it may seem like, I've been dealing with mosquitoes since Christmas, and I usually don't have to deal with them till Valentine's Day. Well, that may be true. That may be true. But in terms of actually making it a milder core season for the insects, that when you get used to them, don't count on it so much. All right, so interesting tidbit related to all this. So have you ever wondered what the most famous insect in meteorology is and weather? Well, in my humble opinion, and I guess I'm probably not the only one, it's got to be the butterfly, right? You've heard the phrase before about a butterfly flapping its wings. Well, all this is born out of something called chaos theory. And yes, chaos theory has its history in weather forecasting. And I'll put a link in the show notes so you can really read about it. But the whole idea, and I actually even talked about this in class this week, is how sensitive weather models are and certain processes, this is why it's called chaos theory, certain processes are to ever so slight changes in the what we call initial conditions. But just imagine, like, when you put stuff into a weather model to run, you put a temperature in, right? And you may have never thought about, what if you round that temperature to whole numbers versus one or two digits after the decimal point? What kind of influence does it have? Well, it's been found out it can have a pretty big influence, and that is what chaos theory is about, and why weather models, good ones, use this ensemble approach. They take that into account and try to give you a forecast, because there are times when it's more important than others. There are situations where it's more important than others, at least in terms of the magnitude. But it also has something to do with why it's hard to forecast weather the further out in time you go. So the butterfly and the butterfly effect and chaos theory. And it is an interesting read. Strange attractors. See, I always thought that there's this thing, that equation that you can do called strange attractors, that also shows the sensitivity, but it gives you a butterfly looking thing. A lot of people talk about how the person who discovered this supposedly said butterfly flaps its wings and you get a tornado. I can't find quotes on that, so I'm not so sure that's exactly what he said, or if it was this strange attractor thing that looked like a butterfly. I get into those things, and even the one that was written by his alma mater at MIT, Dr. Lorenz, it had this story, and it talked about the butterfly flapping its wings thing. And I've also heard that he didn't use the word butterfly, he used something else, like some sort of bird or something. So again, exactly where the butterfly reference came from might still be up for debate. But we're mincing words. Chaos theory still is related to the butterfly effect. Whether it was specifically a butterfly would cause a tornado, whether it was something else, or whether it's this strange attractor thing that creates a butterfly-looking thing, it doesn't really matter, does it? Butterfly, weather, the biggest insect related to weather. I promise you that part of it. All right. Enough about insects, right? We're kind of bugged out at this point. And let's just hope that you now know that the next time you hear, the mild winter led to more mosquitoes. Well, it may have expanded the season a little bit, but more mosquitoes, less mosquitoes. One mosquito's one too many for many people, right? Weather really isn't going to solve your problem on that front. More likely that all the mosquitoes hatching and there being no water. Drought could. That would probably be much more important. That's why a drought would be a good thing. Not so much for everything else we need, food, water, and that kind of stuff. It's the balance of life, right? Okay, let's wrap it up here. Let you get on with your weather-entwined week. Episode soon. We're going to still be hitting the energy. I think that's what's on the schedule for next week. And then we're going to get, like I said, a few different things about alerting apps for visually impaired or weather information for visually impaired. How to grade your meteorologist. I'm going to do something on the solar eclipse that's coming. It's funny. I've been waiting because, a lot of people aren't. Some people have been thinking about it for a while, but not everybody's just been hanging out going, oh, the eclipse is coming. But if you don't know, there's going to be a full solar eclipse that can be seen across the U.S. It's not going to be everywhere in the world. It's been a while since we've had one that's tracked right across the U.S. And the question was more about, how to plan in advance for those that are doing it. Because really, you want to make sure you don't have any clouds. So I've heard some other people talking about it as well. So we'll do an episode on that. But variety of things coming, right? Those are just a handful of them. I was thinking about some more this morning as I was even getting ready for this one. In any case, I don't need to ramble on about future episodes. Those are just a few that are coming your way. Now, let's touch base about how to get hold of us. The email, whatisabouttheweather@gmail.com. The web form, whatisaboutweather.com/contact. Just go there, use the form. Yeah, see, easy enough. Either one of those things. And you're saying, well, why would I want to touch base? Well, that's part of the supporting the podcast, right? RSVP, rate, share, validate, and pledge. And that hits the S part and the V part. Rate, iTunes, whatever it is. Go in there, give us a rating. Helps other people find the podcast. Give us some stars, do that thing. Those pieces help the discoverability. In this day and age where we've got so much content and everything else, if you like it, that's a way for people you don't know to potentially find it. For people you do know, sharing it. Tell them about it, right? Pop in an email, forward something on Facebook or Twitter or wherever I might post it. Well, just type it yourself. Say, hey, I found this great podcast. Just put it out there. Put a link to stuff. Validate. Do send us feedback. Show ideas. What you like, what you don't like, what you might want to hear us talk about, all those sort of things. Pledge. If you're getting some value out of the podcast. If you want to make sure that we can keep doing it and that our equipment doesn't break down and that our hosting's always there, those sort of things, consider supporting the podcast with a pledge. Whatisabouttheweather.com/support. We give you two pretty easy ways to do it. One is with Patreon, which is kind of more like a monthly subscription, which many of us do a variety of those things, Netflix, maybe even other podcasts. Or you can do PayPal if doing a one-time donation is just easier for you. Either type's greatly appreciated, and yes, it does go to help defray the cost of keeping this podcast going. But enough about RSVP, and let's just say, as we close out another week, may your weather week be intertwined in a way that's interesting and informative and enlightening. Because as we all know, there's much more to weather than the weather itself.